I want to talk today about unconditional love and what that really means in the context of a relationship, a functional, here and now, day to day relationship. Because sure, you can have unconditional love, but having unconditional love inside of a relationship and even basing a relationship on the idea of unconditional love is a whole different matter. And I think it's worth discussing because this idea actually gets in the way of us building and keeping the relationships that we really want in our lives. We love to throw this phrase around, but let's be honest, in real life, when you're actually trying to relate to another person in a romantic partnership, unconditional love is not enough, if even possible, or at least it doesn't do very much to help you have a fulfilling relationship. Unconditional love sounds romantic, but it is terrible relationship advice. In fact, believing that it's enough or even necessary at all for a good and satisfying relationship can sabotage your chances of finding the easiest, most compatible, and most rewarding connections that you could have in your life. Hi, I'm Madalena, and this is You Reclaimed. Around here, we talk about how childhood trauma, anxiety, and emotional dysregulation in general, how these things shape our lives now, and how we can work with these patterns so that we can finally live meaningful, fulfilling lives on our own terms. Before we get into it, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on your notifications so that you don't miss any future videos. And if you're finding this content helpful, please give it a like. It really helps the channel grow. Now, some of you will say right away, wait, of course, unconditional love exists. Parents love their children unconditionally. God loves us unconditionally. And yes, I think that's true. There is unconditional love. It does exist. And in some places, it truly belongs. It easily makes sense. Babies and children, for example, are dependent on us to be loved and cared for no matter what. It's assumed that they can act selfishly or cry endlessly and we'll still care for them, even love them unconditionally, and that's appropriate. In fact, humanity depends on parents being able to offer their offspring unconditional, selfless love at a time when it's absolutely necessary. And in adulthood, we can also love people unconditionally. We can feel tremendous love selflessly at our own expense exclusively, regardless of whether or not the other person actually meets any of our needs. But here's the distinction. Unconditional love on its own, it doesn't make a relationship work. You can love someone unconditionally and still not be able to live with them, still not be able to trust them or build a life with them. In other words, unconditional love exists, but in adult romantic partnerships, it simply is not enough. Unconditional love, or even love in general, is not even necessary to have a good relationship. Love is a feeling, it's a felt experience. Relationships, on the other hand, are agreements. Don't confuse the two. Relationships don't last because of unconditional love. They last because of compatibility, because of reciprocity, and because of the conditions that each person is willing and able to meet. This is especially difficult for those of us who grew up in some sort of emotional trauma, childhood trauma, to process and accept. Many of us didn't get enough of the unconditional love and care we should have received during the only stage of life when it was most possible and appropriate as young children with our caregivers. That leaves deep attachment wounds, a kind of emptiness that we can spend much of our adult lives trying to fill. And that hunger for unconditional love, it can blind us to what's actually required to sustain real, functional relationships with other adults. And here's something else. When we say that we want unconditional love from another adult, what we're often really asking for is acceptance. Acceptance of who we are and as we are. But this is where it starts to get a little bit confusing because many of us don't even know who we are that well. We're still working that out. So, what is it we actually want others to accept about us? What traits do we want them to overlook in us that they wouldn't otherwise want to overlook? And if we're honest, we ourselves don't offer unconditional acceptance to other adults either. We don't want to tolerate every behavior or every flaw in another person, and that's reasonable. In fact, attempting to offer unconditional love to people who don't offer us good relational conditions is a recipe for all kinds of abuse and toxic relationships. But our craving for this kind of blanket acceptance has deep, deep roots in those early years when unconditional love should have been given and was perhaps lacking. That's why it's so hard to accept that this is not the basis of adult relational connections. In real life, we don't enter into relationships without any conditions. Whether we acknowledge those conditions openly, we admit them to ourselves or to each other, or we keep them completely unspoken, the conditions are always there. We're all looking at the terms being offered by a potential partner. It's why we date in the first place. Does this other person bring me joy or pleasure in some way? Does this person bring me emotional or even financial security? Can I have the kind of life or lifestyle I want with this other person by my side? Do I feel safe and cared for with them? Am I attracted to them? Meaning, can I experience desire and intimacy and sexuality with this other person? Does this other person add to my life or do they subtract from it? The truth is, relationships are built on an exchange of conditions. And relationships don't collapse because love disappears. They collapse because conditions aren't being met. Our conditions may be different, but they're always there. And when those conditions stop being met, relationships start to break down. It's then that we run into cycles of never-ending conflict. And the conflict is really where we attempt to get our ideal conditions met through this conflict, through working things out. Now, maybe on a higher plane, we can love someone unconditionally, but on the ground, in the day-to-day reality of living and interacting together, when the conditions we entered into the relationship under start to change, our relationship with the relationship itself changes. In essence, when the initial conditions that compelled us to say yes to someone are no longer present, the relationship runs into trouble. That's why we see such high divorce rates, because conditions matter, and they matter a lot. This also means it's in our best interest to find relationships where the conditions are naturally easy for both people to meet. In other words, what you require in order not to feel stressed and aggravated or constantly bothered by me should be things I can meet without straining too much. And the same goes the other way around. What I need in order to feel good and healthy and content shouldn't be constantly violated by who you are as a human being and how you want to live. When those conditions are aligned, we call that compatibility. Let's illustrate this with the idea of conscientiousness. Imagine that one person is highly conscientious, organized, punctual, very detail-oriented, and the other is very laid back, perhaps spontaneous, but a bit careless about follow-through. At first, this difference might even feel exciting to both people. The conscientious partner admires the other's carefree spirit, and the relaxed partner enjoys feeling grounded by someone so structured. But over time, those are the same differences that can become conditions that are impossible to ignore. The conscientious partner starts to feel disrespected by lateness, by forgotten responsibilities, by the sense that they can't rely on the other person. Meanwhile, the laid-back partner starts to feel nagged and controlled and constantly judged. Neither person is wrong, but their natural way of being constantly grates and violates the other's conditions for what makes a relationship feel good. That's why compatibility isn't about unconditional love. It's about whether your natural tendencies, whether they line up with the conditions that your partner needs to feel respected and safe and at peace, and vice versa. We see this promise of unconditional love pretty much everywhere. Movies, love songs, self help memes, all of them tell us that real love means unconditional love, hand in hand with unconditional acceptance. The message is if someone really loves me, they'll accept me no matter what. But the easiest way to look at this is to simply separate the idea of unconditional love from the idea of a relationship. Let's take a more extreme but very clear example. Say I'm in a relationship with someone I love deeply. One of the conditions we've agreed on is exclusivity, a monogamous relationship. Now, if my partner breaks that condition and has an affair, you might assume my love for them would end. Betrayal of trust should erase love, right? But that's not actually what happens in real life. It's not how it works. What actually happens is that I can still love that person at a higher level. I might even feel unconditional love for them if I felt that in the first place. But what's been broken are the conditions of the relationship itself that we agreed to. So while I can continue to love this person, I may also decide that living with them day to day has become utterly unpleasant or unsafe or just simply unsatisfying. Unconditional love doesn't cancel out broken trust. In other words, I can still love you and at the same time say, I wish you well, but I'm out. The same thing happens with major disagreements. For example, let's say I refuse to work on myself and my partner insists that both of us need to do some sort of healing work in order to have a peaceful relationship. That's their condition. If I refuse, which I suppose I have a right to do, then they may still love me unconditionally, but they won't be able to stay in relationship with me because the conditions they require to feel stable and safe aren't being met. So yes, unconditional love for another person is certainly possible, but unconditional relationships, those by and large do not exist. I learned this lesson for myself in my early 20s, which I suppose is for the best. I was in a young, hopeful relationship that felt very loving, but it wasn't really built on a lot of compatibility. It was built on romantic idealism, as a lot of young relationships are. When that relationship ended, one of my ex's parting observations stuck with me for years after. He told me, maybe you're just not capable of unconditional love. What he meant was that he wanted to be loved without meeting any of the conditions that, for me, actually made our connection feel like a partnership. I needed certain things like social interaction. I needed to leave the house and do things together to feel that togetherness out in the world. I needed a sense of shared purpose and ambition. None of those things were his fault. They were simply glaring incompatibilities between us. I'm sure I was not meeting all of his conditions either. But even back then, his words puzzled me. I remember thinking, what a strange way to look at this. Instead of recognizing that we were incompatible in how we wanted to live our lives, his framing was as if the problem was that I couldn't love him unconditionally. And I don't remember having any kind of problems with love in that relationship. But for a while, I even wondered if he was right. Maybe I wasn't capable of unconditional love. Over the years, I came to see things more clearly. Love and conditions are separate. It wasn't that I couldn't love unconditionally. Love was not a problem. It was that I couldn't, or perhaps I wasn't willing to, build a relationship without conditions. Love is a feeling. I can certainly feel beautiful feelings of love towards you, but conditions are what make a relationship possible. You can have a relationship without unconditional love, and you can certainly have unconditional love without a relationship. Whether the two can coexist in the same package depends entirely on whether the conditions for being together are actually being met. And 20 years later, I still stand by that line of thinking. Think of it like this. Every relationship you enter into with another person is an agreement of sorts, not a formal contract you have to sign necessarily, although I'm sure that you could do that if you wanted to, but usually an unspoken set of conditions that create, well, the frame, right? The box of that relationship. Those conditions might include things like respect, like attraction, intimacy, trust, mutual care. While those conditions are being met, the relationship tends to run quite smoothly. And the better you choose in the first place, meaning the more naturally compatible your partner is with the conditions that you require to feel good in a relationship, the easier and smoother that relationship will be. Compatibility is just a fancy word for conditions that match up. That's why choosing someone you have day-to-day compatibility with matters so much. But when enough of those conditions are removed, the relationship, well, it starts to collapse. That doesn't necessarily mean you stop loving the other person on a deeper, perhaps higher level, but it does mean that the partnership, the daily reality of building a life together, it might come to an end. That's not to say that if conditions change tomorrow, your partner gets sick, your partner loses their job, you go through a hard time. If conditions change temporarily, it doesn't mean that everything falls apart. But if conditions change and stay that way, it might very well mean that a relationship beyond that point is not possible. That's just the reality of it. Let's take another simple but broad example. Imagine that someone marries their partner, and years into the relationship, that partner completely changes how they treat them. Maybe they start being rude, aggressive, maybe they stop caring, stop listening, stop showing any affection. Any number of things can change. You can still love your partner beyond that point, but the conditions that made the relationship pleasant and possible and enticing in the first place, well, they've disappeared. And most people don't like to admit that this is the real reason they want to exit relationships, because it's not just that we want unconditional love. We also want to be seen as people capable of unconditional love. We want others to believe that we can love without limits. So instead, people say things like, I fell out of love, or I don't know what went wrong. I just don't feel the same anymore. But more often than not, what really happened underneath is pretty simple. The conditions that made the relationship appealing in the first place, they changed, and they could no longer live with those changes. Falling out of love is a lot of the time just code for the conditions changed so drastically that it was no longer possible to sustain a relationship. And the point isn't about one specific condition, whether it's weight or money or status or habits or anything. The point is that every person has their own set of conditions they want fulfilled in a relationship. And with that, everyone has their own set of limits, limits to how much they're willing to live without those conditions being met. When those limits are crossed, the relationship becomes impossible. So the next time you find yourself hoping to meet someone who can love you unconditionally, or that you yourself can love unconditionally, pause and ask yourself, what are the actual day-to-day conditions I need in order to feel safe, to feel cared for, and to feel good in a relationship? And what are the conditions that I am willing to offer to someone else so that they can feel the same with me? Because here's the truth. Love that ignores all conditions, it doesn't exist in adult human relationships. And if you keep waiting for that, you may find yourself waiting forever. And in the process, overlooking relationships with very favorable conditions where you could actually feel deeply satisfied. Love may be unconditional, but relationships never are. What do you think? Is unconditional love possible in the day-to-day reality of adult relationships? Or is it just something we say to comfort ourselves? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear from you. As always, Thank you for watching. If you want to go deeper into this kind of work, I have some free resources on attachment styles and emotional safety that are available at my website, youreclaimedproject.com. You'll also find those resources always listed in the description below, free to download. Until next time.